Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today to bring up two key priorities, two important unmet needs, which I hope this body and the U.S. House will act on immediately and certainly by the end of the year. The first is the Steve Gleason Act, which we passed last year. It was legislation I drafted, which passed last year, but for a limited period of time, and we need to make that permanent for reasons I'll explain. And the second, even broader need is to ensure that victims of the recent flooding in Louisiana, many families whose lives were devastated in really incalculable terms, get the aid they need. We made an important down payment on that before we wrapped up business before the elections, with the understanding that we would clearly revisit the issue between now and the end of the year. First, the Steve Gleason Act. As I said, Madam President, last year I'm very happy that the Senate and the House passed my legislation, the Bipartisan Steve Gleason Act of 2015, and it provided immediate relief to ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease and other similar patients who needed the help to make sure they had access to important, really life-changing medical equipment. Now, I first heard about this need in 2014 when thousands of patients and patient advocates and others came to Congress in order to bring attention to the devastating consequences of what was then a brand new Medicare policy. The devices they were concerned with are critical for patients who have lost their ability to speak, to communicate with friends and family and doctors, to call 911 in case of emergency, ALS patients and others with similar debilitating diseases. These patients are locked in, unable to communicate, and it's only because of really miraculous, relatively new devices that they can communicate with caregivers and the outside world. In most cases, this involves they're using a computer screen and keypad where they literally make eye contact with the keyboard on a computer screen, type out a message, and then the computer, through a computer voice, articulates that message to caregivers, family, doctors, and the outside world. Because of a Medicare change, a unprovoked, unnecessary change in Medicare policy, many of these patients were denied access to these life-changing devices. The devices were literally confiscated in thousands of cases. They were not allowed to use this technological miracle to make them more fully independent. Well, thank goodness, enter Steve Gleason, a super advocate for the ALS community, an ALS patient himself. Steve's a former player for the New Orleans Saints. He famously blocked a punt during the first game in which the Saints reopened the Superdome after Hurricane Katrina. And tragically, a few years after that, he was diagnosed with ALS himself. Just as he gave the city of New Orleans a rallying point around which to rebuild after the devastation of Hurricane Katrina, through his organization, Team Gleason, Steve also gives the ALS community and their families hope and a rallying point with his motto, "No white flags." I believe Steve's wife, Michelle, summed up the cause of ALS patients like Steve and their loved ones succinctly when she said, quote, "What causes me the most pain is the loss of his voice. I love hearing his voice. I want him to talk to me and to our son Rivers. This disease takes his body. To take his voice just seems unfair," close quote. And of course, this is what this life-changing device and this similar medical equipment helps plug the gap about. And this is what the horrible reversal in Medicare policy, why it caused so many problems. Steve and I worked together on legislation that would reverse that policy change and would give folks with ALS their voices back. Steve was my guest to the State of the Union speech in 2015. That day, we met with Secretary of Health and Human Services Sylvia Burwell, and we were able to build major momentum, resulting in members on both sides of the aisle and both houses of Congress coming together and eventually passing my Steve Gleason Act of 2015, which became law on July 30th of last year. Senator Klobuchar from Minnesota and Senator King from Maine were especially supportive and aggressive in getting this bill to the finish line, and I thank them again for their partnership and their support. The act reinstated the long-standing Medicare policy to offer immediate relief for patients experiencing incredible difficulty accessing the important life-changing equipment I described. And so that Steve Gleason Act of 2015 was a huge win for thousands of ALS patients and their families and caregivers and others. But we need to make this act permanent. It's of limited duration as it was passed this last year. We need to make it permanent. It's as simple as that, and we need to do it between now and the end of the year. And so I encourage all of my colleagues to come together as we did last year to take this common sense step to empower these patients to be in touch with the outside world and their family and their caregivers, literally give them voice, literally empower them as Steve has inspired and empowered so many others with ALS. Madam President, I also